Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for this great conversation that I'm going to have with Senator Cory Booker. I'm so excited that he's here to talk about his take on what's going on in our country in matters of equity and justice. It's a huge honor that he is my senator. And I will say that for a long, long time, I believe that he's really provided a moral voice on so many social justice issues. And I'm super grateful that he's my senator. You know that sometimes when you're asked that question, who would you love to have dinner or coffee with if you could? Well, I'm getting to have that moment right now because Senator Booker has agreed to join me in talking about equity and justice and my new book on white Christian privilege. So thank you so much, Senator Booker, for being here.
First of all, please drop the senator. We said tonight it's going to be Khyati and Cory. Okay. And I really I appreciate to talk to you a little bit about issues of faith and spirit. And even more challenging, I think, is our own history and telling the truths about our nation that don't diminish our country when we really confront the challenges and even the wretchedness of our past, but help to build a greater nation when we recognize the truth of that history. And I have a ton of questions for you because I think it's such a powerful book. And I think that the practical elements of what you call for, it's almost like you give really a roadmap with very great stories about how do we advance. But I'd love to just know right away, like, why are you writing this book? And I know I have some of my friends on tonight, so I think I would also like for you to tell them a little bit about your bio, which is so unique in and of itself.
Well, I have been thinking about the concepts of white Christian privilege for about 20 years and actually living them much longer than that. I'm a social scientist, professor at Fairleigh Dickinson here in New Jersey. And I've been researching, writing, workshopping about race, religion, immigration, social justice for the last 20 years. And what I have seen, I work with educators, school administrators, all kinds of folks. And what I have seen is that actually, like you brought up history, Cory, and people, I really could feel that people really do want to know real U.S. history. People are realizing now big time that we haven't learned real United States history, but I've seen that happening for the last 20 years when I would talk about these things. This book is both a personal and professional project for me. Professionally, because of the things that I do, but also in the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of books come out about whiteness and whiteness in America. But one thing that's been missing, which I hope my book fills, is really understanding the role Christianity has played in the construction of white supremacy. And once we can see that, we can see the injustices that have happened, then we can move towards justice. The personal kind of project for this book is that I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I identify as Indian American Hindu. And honestly, growing up, if you weren't Black and you weren't white, it was kind of like, what are you? And then when my family or when we said we were Hindu, there was no sense of, well, what is that? Thankfully, I grew up with a really strong Indian American Hindu community in Atlanta that really sustained me and nurtured me. But this book, it's really about being able to give language to people to articulate some of the things that go on. There were times where I experienced discrimination because of the way I looked, because of my name, because of my skin, everything. But there were other times, Cory, where I just didn't fit in. I didn't know, if you will, kind of like the secret password. One specific example I can give you is when I was in English class, and I didn't do so well in English class. But I kind of, I was like in the back row sitting there. And one day my teacher she was teaching us similes and metaphors. And she said, blah, 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 similes and metaphors, like in the Good Samaritan story, and then moved on. It was expected that I would know what that was, but I had no idea. But I also knew that I better not ask because it seemed like I should have known. So that's kind of just one small example of the everyday ways that people can be marginalized, and we have this normative idea of Christianity in our language and culture.
Well, let's unpack this a little while, because I've got these two friends, New Jersey professors, both of them, that both start their book by talking about the American myth, the sort of Disneyland version. Both New Jersey professors, one's Professor Eddie Glaude in his book about James Baldwin, and you and yours both go to the heart of the stories we tell ourselves about our country that make us feel good, but really do us a deep, deep disservice. And you go right at it by talking about this idea that we were founded on religious freedom, and you expound upon what that means. But really, as I know, and I'm reading a lot about, I'm doing my a re-study of Frederick Douglass right now. And wow, I just reread, I actually listened to it on audible.com, walking through the bowels of the Senate, listening to this a former enslaved person tell the stories of his years of slavery, which are so brutal. But he goes at it right at Christianity and how it was used to subjugate, to oppress both women and blacks. And so could you just talk for a minute about what is the danger in the stories we tell ourselves about our history and how it makes a big difference to the present?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, it goes back to first grade when we all learned that the Puritans came here seeking religious freedom, but actually they were kind of in it for themselves. They were seeking religious freedom for themselves. They weren't in it for everybody, but we're taught that they were in it for everybody. And so that's really one of the biggest myths that we've got to start busting. The Native Americans wouldn't have been treated the way they were. They wouldn't have been talked about as being uncivilized, and they were considered uncivilized. Part of the reason was because they weren't Christian, right? And so we could start there, but actually we can go back to the papal decrees with the doctrine of discovery that basically said to the colonizers, if they come upon land that is not inhabited by Christians, it's theirs to take, So we have to understand that I think is really the foundation for manifest destiny, of us seeking, believing that, and when I say us, the us back in the 18th and 19th century wouldn't have included you and me, but I do.
And so, but that's such an important distinction. Like, in other words, they were coming here for their religious freedom, but it wasn't like namaste, the divinity in me sees the divinity in you. They did not see the divinity in anyone else. You're a heathen, and you, in a sense, we have this view that we must conquer you or turn you into Christians. And so it was actually not about freedom. It was about, we're going to come and then we're going to try to impose our beliefs on other people.
Yeah, and that they were ordained by God to take this land from sea to shining sea. And it didn't matter who was there, So I think we have to understand, and, we will learn about manifest destiny in school, but it's not interrogated as looking at how it holds up whiteness and how it holds up Christianity. And the other thing is, because people believe that we have freedom of religion enshrined in the First Amendment, Cory, there is a sense, well, it's there on paper, so it must exist in reality. And that's just not true. And that's why I talk about it being religious equality being an illusion, because we think it's there because it's there on paper. But if it was really a reality, then we wouldn't have synagogues and gurudwaras and Hindu temples, being objected to when communities want to build those structures across our nation. So we have to see that not every religion can be practiced as freely as Christianity. And then we have to see how that intersects with race, because we know what has happened to Black churches in this country, and they have not, people have not wanted those around and those congregations around either.
But you cannot oppress a people unless you dehumanize them and degrade them, and create literally second-class status for women. As ordained by God, you are in a second-class status. So people used the veneer of religion, Christian faith, to subjugate women, and you had to dehumanize Native Americans, dehumanize Black Americans in the process. And so religious belief, in a sense, became that reinforced the ability to be oppressive and degrading, and really became the justification for such butchering, such brutality, such vicious violence in a very violent period of American history.
Yeah, and the thing is that I think a lot of times people think, that because we don't see the oppression in that violent form anymore, that it's not out there. But we see it in other ways. We see how Christianity gets used along with whiteness when we had the issues with the Ground Zero Mosque, with the Muslim community center that was going to be built in Lower Manhattan. We see it with the ways that, people talk about who should be in the United States and who can be an American. I mean, Christian privilege is an issue when individuals are running for office, and people who are racial and religious minorities are often questioned, sometimes in very direct ways, and sometimes in indirect ways, to find out about their faith and if they're Christian or not.
Right. And I want to bring it to the front, but by the way, a lot of atheist friends of mine feel very much like that this idea of religious freedom almost by definition means if you don't have a religion, you're not free. Yeah. And so, but this historic chords that justified long periods, literally from the 1600s all the way to the mid 20th century, really, of by law, the subjugation. Women's minorities of all types were sort of living a second-class status. And I want to bring it a little more to the present because, there's a lot about your experience that I feel a little bit of a kinship to as a guy. I grew up in Bergen County. We were the first Black family to integrate the town that we lived in. My brother was the first Black kid to go to Harrington Park Elementary. And in many ways, what a blessing it was to grow up in such a nurturing town of just grace and decency and neighbors. But the cultural divide was big from just Black and white, and that extended all the way to church pews. I mean, I grew up in a Black church, but I can imagine what the difference of that, where people didn't even, I still remember, I love when your last name is the same as one of the most important people in my first city council race, a woman named Khyati Joshi, who was just amazing. And she would come out and campaign with me in diverse neighborhoods, but often people would just assume she's Latino because there wasn't that sort of cultural awareness of sort of the breadth of diversity and possibility. But I do want to get back to some of the hot lines that you just said, the points where we're really tested as a nation. And the Ground Zero Mosque was the one. Trump, who began his, people saying like, oh, Democrats playing the race card. Trump began his campaign coming down an elevator, talking about Muslims, Mexicans. I mean, he was right out front with race right away and trying to whip up, in a sense, the fears of a society that has such deep roots. And I'm just wondering, like, as I watched the 9/11 mosque, the controversy over that community center, and I know you discussed that in the book, but I guess it shows you that in many ways, where a lot of times these ideals of what our fundamental rights are can be within our political context. So demagogues can take fear and lack of knowledge. I love how you say in the end of your book, I think you quote Brian Stevenson about talking about one of the urgency to be proximate to people. And I always say, as someone who talks about love all the time, that love demands knowledge.
Right.
You can't love someone without knowing them. And if you stay within your cultural comfort zone, how could you truly begin to love others if such an important part of the fabric are so many different faiths, Sikh, Jain, Baha'i? I could go through a lot of the other faiths, but then you encounter somebody with a turban on, and a lot of my Sikh friends, who people are so ignorant of their religion, they think they say you're Muslim, and all the kind of hatred that they've been experiencing, especially rising under the time of Trump. So I'm wondering, there's a sense of, I love this idea that you talk about, that we need the head, which is what we've been talking about, understanding the heart and the hand. Could you sort of talk about that as that's why I think your book is so important, because it goes in deep on the head parts, but you're really pulling people to the heart and then ultimately to the action hand.
Yeah, the head is about, we are going to have this information. We need to know more accurate United States history. We need to know, and we need to understand particular events from a variety of perspectives. So, and we need to have that intellectual information. We can't only be relying on opinions and experiences, because sometimes there's misinformation there. The heart is not what most people might think. While it is about caring, it's actually understanding that there is an emotional reaction to actually learning this information. And so one of the examples I talk about in the book is some students who were really having a difficult time in a class I was teaching on race, religion, and the law, because they just saw me bringing up these events, and they actually reported me to the chair of the department as, Professor Joshi hates white people. And what I knew was that they were having a reaction to this information, both the info and, in this case, me as the person bringing it to them. So we have to understand that learning Plessy versus Ferguson is not emotionally neutral. People have reactions to this. Some people can feel guilty, some people can feel sad, some people can be mad. And then the hand is about really taking action. While I want folks to—
Can I pause you for a second there? Sure. But the feelings, the story about you and your class as a professor, like I never heard that before. A professor saying, "How does this make you feel?"
Yeah.
Because that is very important. If people are feeling threatened or falling into a defensive crouch, that's where you see often the so-called backlash, or people fighting and getting to the heart of the feelings. In many ways, this is not taking away from you. This is not diminishing you. This is not attacking you, as a Christian, as someone white. This is deepening understanding. And I just love that in your classes, you're asking people to not only give answers, but talk about their feelings and their heart. That's got to be a value that's really important to you.
Yeah, it takes students by surprise at first, and I tell them, how you feel and how you feel. And by about a third into the semester, they're kind of like, okay, now they're used to it, but they're not used to understanding. And I do explain to them why I'm asking them that, because most of my classes are for educators and soon to be educators, soon to be teachers. And so, this is really important that they understand and also ask these questions of our current K through 12 students out there. So it's really important. I suspect you can think of times when you learned about information and had a negative or, positive emotional reaction to it. And we have to kind of hone into that.
Well, I mean, I've wrestled with my own faith, Christianity. And I always tell my Christian friends that if you're not wrestling with your faith, you're not just like deepening your faith. And if you're not questioning your faith, even and to some extent. And so there were a lot of elements of exclusivity that I found. Is how can you say that this person's going to hell, and this person's not? And really started studying theology just for those reasons. I mean, how could I have the radical love of Jesus Christ, and then everybody from Reinhold Niebuhr to just some of the great theologians that showed me this kind of love.
Yeah.
And it really made me forced me to try to understand that if I am recognizing the divinity in everyone, how can I align my faith with it? And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it is uncomfortable, and it was good that I was uncomfortable. And so making myself feel that uncomfort, it's actually a sign of growth for me. And humility, like I believe the first fundamental aspect of religion should be humility. If I'm admitting the presence of the divine, then I have to recognize some so greater than me, then who am I to have all the answers? And if we're all created in sort of the creation of God, of Christian fundamental pillar, so it's all the Abrahamic faiths, then I should be humbled before God's creation. So it was very hard, but it really got me, I'm pulling up something I wrote when I was in the mayor of the town I was in, because I just found myself in so many arguments with fellow Christians about LGBTQ issues, about anti-Semitism, about anti-Islam. And I finally wrote this. I said, before you speak to me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people.
Yes.
Before you tell me how much you love your God, show it to me in how much you love all his children. Before you preach to me of your passion for your faith, teach it to me through your compassion for your neighbors. In the end, I'm not as interested in what you have to tell or sell as in how you choose to give and live. And so for me, I think that what it seems like you're doing in your classroom is really helping that last point of the hand. What you do defines you, right? And how you, if you know these issues, if you've connected to your feelings in the way I think that you challenge us to, just tell me what that last part is about the hand.
Yeah, well, I will first let me say that I have heard you say those words before, and they usually, stir up things in me. And you might be able to hear it in my voice now that I'm always very touched. And it is why having you take part in this conversation with me is so meaningful, because I've seen you out there for years and years, and the conviction in which not only you speak, but then take action, whether it's legislative or being out there, like when we were together at a rally in Patterson protesting the Muslim ban. That is why I'm so grateful to have a leader like you. So I wanted to say that first. But the hand is about taking action. It's about what you just said, and it's about doing what you've been doing. Of course, I want people to read this book and other books or listen to the audio. But ultimately, it is about taking action. And what you said about being uncomfortable, and that questioning your faith made you uncomfortable. Most of the growth that happens when we're uncomfortable.
Yes.
And we have to be able to see that. That's something else I try to get folks in my workshops and in my teaching to understand, is that it can feel kind of icky in that moment, but if you can hang in there, there's so much growth, and that we're going to have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable to actually make change in this country.
Oh, God bless you for saying that, because I first wrestled with my own faith and just read everything I could get my hands on, unpacking the patriarchy within the Christian faith, the racism, and how it was used to oppress, but even going further and further. But then I had a great Christian mentor at Stanford who just said, you can't truly know your own faith until you've taken time to learn other faiths. I mean, it really challenged me, starting with Judaism, frankly, because he said Jesus was a Jew, and there's so much of the cultural context. The Sabbath table, that's the Last Supper. He started challenging me with all these things that understanding cultural context, understanding history was so powerful for me. And it just took me off on an odyssey. I mean, I remember I went to India in the year 20 years ago, the year 2000, and enrolled in a course to learn a lot more about Hinduism while I was there. And every time I would go deeper in another faith, I found my own being enriched, and found my love of humanity even greater. It just was opening me up to the grandeur of the universe and the beauty and the wisdom. I mean, Hinduism is thousands and thousands of years old, and wrestling with the Bhagavad Gita, wrestling with some of the greatest ideas of what it means to be a good person.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say is, like, the beauty of what you said about that protest. I tell people all the time, one of my favorite moments as an American was rushing out to Dulles Airport in the minutes after the aftermath, and all people were running out there, and I was going there because I had a federal court order to get the detained Muslim families, Muslim individuals, access to an attorney. But I got stopped in my tracks when I saw how many hundreds of other people were gathered there. And there was this moment where Muslim families would come out from the gate being released, and people would cheer and sing patriotic songs. And this is this is what my country looks like. But I still remember one of my favorite scenes was these Orthodox Jewish men. I mean, I'm talking tzitzis hanging out and black hats and and kippas, and they were dancing and singing with a sort of level of joy and ecstasy, like as if I was at a Jewish wedding. And here I remembered this phrase from the Torah, welcome the stranger because you are a stranger in a strange land. And that moral consistency. And you know that there are a lot of faith groups that stuck by the president because whatever he says must be, this guy who is such a pillar of religious piety. But yet here were this orthodox, very conservative by the dress group that was living in fierce adherence and welcoming Muslims coming into this country like Abraham welcomed strangers in the desert to his tent. It was powerful for me.
I remember when you were running out to the airport, and that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the kind of the actions you take, to make sure that you're working for justice. I mean, I myself have, I've learned a lot about my own faith. I'm so glad you mentioned mentors, because I wouldn't be where I am without one specific mentor at Emory University, Dr. David Blumenthal, who, when I was learning about Judaism, I ended up learning more about my own Hinduism.
Wow.
I am absolutely right there with you. And I grew up, let me tell you something, the only thing I knew about Christianity while I was growing up is that I was going to hell because I didn't accept
it. Yes.
And it wasn't until I was in college that I learned about the life of Jesus, and then, as you know, I am married to a white Episcopalian man. And that was some serious wrestling, because he's very steadfast in his faith and I am steadfast in mine. And it was like we were determined, if we were going to do this, that it was going to be Hindu and Christian together. And I will say that for the last 20 plus years, that is how we have raised our son and how we have lived our life. And it hasn't necessarily been easy. And you struggle when you're challenged with questions, but you absolutely grow, absolutely grow.
Well, the challenge is people look at the title of your book, they're going to be like, oh, I don't want to read about, people are going to try to dismiss it as opposed to confronting what makes them feel uncomfortable in that and unpacking it. And I guess I have a couple final questions for you. Like, first is, who do you dedicate the book to and why? I know the answer to the first part, but tell people who you dedicate this book to and why.
This book is dedicated to Kedar Wallace Bartlett, our son, who has been raised as a Hindu and Episcopalian. And it's really about building a more perfect union for him and for actually all of our kids. But I hope in a way that acknowledges and brings in all religions, as well as people who are atheists and agnostics. So that's who it's dedicated to.
Well, I just think that this book is one that I hope people will find that delivers on its aspirations. And I really pray, if I can say that as a person of faith, that people take the time. And you did record it too, so people can listen to it?
Yeah, I didn't do the recording. The press took care of that, but it is available on Audible. It's on Audible.
A great Newark company, so I'm going to plug them.
That's right. I see you driving through. Yeah.
Yes. And it is beautiful to me when I saw the dedication page that your son has within him the aspirations of this book. In other words, the greatness of this culture, I think, is that diversity, if we embrace it, not as an adornment, but really that idea of getting to know our diversity, that it makes us stronger and better in many ways. Him who has his roots in, frankly, is in a bridge in many ways to the cultural divides, that he can indeed be an agent of what I aspire our country to do, is be a more beloved community. And so I think that you have, when I gave up, you can be mad at me for what I'm about to say, but I said writing a book in a sense is giving birth. It's like, and it is, I'm sure, nothing like it that I could ever imagine, but it is painful. It is hard. But it is a labor. And yet you have given life to this text, which I think is timeless because of its rooting in history and to this moment and anticipating, frankly, the work we still have to do. So I just pray that your book is successful. I pray that people here will read it, will listen to it, but let it challenge you to, as you said, head, heart, and then the work to the hands. Because ultimately that's the work we have to do. If we can't, as a society, know our truths, not the Disneyland version of our history, can begin to connect it to our spirit and heart. I love the way you kind of write this part, which is really about that it is emotion that often activates us. And then do the work of getting proximate to people, getting next to people. What's that one great theologian says? Maybe it was the current or former pope that said, I want you to go out amongst the people and smell like your flock. This idea of getting so intimate with the people that you serve that you smell like your people.
That's what we have to do.
Yes, yes.
So, well, I really appreciate it. I'm so thankful that you take a moral stance on issues. We have to make topics that I think are moral but aren't as labeled as such sometimes, like environmental justice is a moral issue.
Yes.
You know? And talk about it. The conservative Christian movement should not be the ones who get to label what is moral, and that is what has happened. I think those of us who are of faith and who believe in really the promise of this country have to speak out more and do more. So thank you so much, Cory.
Well, you in so many ways you live what you've put in this book, and I just think that ultimately you're challenging us to love, not through words, but by doing the work of love and healing and growth and coming together. And you embody that in your family, and you embody it in this book. And I'm really grateful for you writing it. And I'm thrilled to see the lives that are going to be touched and affected by it. So thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.